Greetings loyal subscribers and honoured guests. It's time for me to go over each and every game included in the Namco Museum Collection 2 for the Evercade. Just a quick note for new Evercade owners before I begin. This collection, along with Namco Museum Collection 1, currently aren't compatible with the Evercade vs home console. They only work on the handheld systems such as the new AXP or the original Evercade. This is because Blaze were only able to secure a license for handheld use with Namco. This may yet change, but I don't hold out much hope. If you pick up an HDMI mini cable, you can still enjoy the games on your TV, although I did have some trouble getting this to work on my EXP and had to go back to my trusty Purple Edition handheld to capture all the footage in this video. There are 11 games included on this cartridge in total and a nice mixture of genres and eras. So without further ado, let's get started. We begin with Burning Force for the Mega Drive, which did also have an arcade release in Japan. You could, if you were feeling a tad uncharitable, label it as a Space Harrier clone, alongside the likes of 3D World Runner on the NES by Squaresoft. I think it does have a little bit more going on than a simple copy of Sega's arcade classic though. For starters, we have that anime-esque presentation, which packs in some nice detail, some very nicely drawn cartoon interstitials between the stages, and an eye-popping use of colour. The game sees you taking control of 21-year-old Hiromi Tengenji, who is a cadet in training at Earth University. She is undertaking her graduate test over the span of 6 days, with each day being divided into 3 sections, 2 main stage sections, a boss section, and a bonus round for each day. As a departure from Space Harrier, the bike that you pilot in the main stages has no pitch controls. You are locked to the ground. Then at the end of each game day, your bike transforms into more of a fighter ship and you finally do get full flight control when you go up against the bosses. I found after the relative simplicity of just having to worry about steering left and right, suddenly having to worry about dodging up and down proved rather challenging. You do get used to it after a short while though, and can then focus on blasting the boss's weak points that were handily pointed out to you during a briefing just before the fight. To aid you in combat, you can pick up a few different power-ups throughout the stages, including a wider beam or a focused laser, as well as homing missiles and more conventional green bombs. There are also your fairly standard health pickups. Sometimes you need to make use of jump pads on the ground to reach these power-ups, or to avoid hazards that will do you damage. You don't die outright, you have an energy meter, so that makes the game a bit more forgiving than Space Harrier. You also have a bank of 4 or so continues, which is more than enough for a fairly lengthy game. You should be able to make it a little bit further with each try as you learn the challenges presented by each level. Before I give my final score for Burning Force, I quickly want to take a look at what the magazines of the time were giving the game. Sega Pro magazine from the UK had a feature called The Profile, which was a brief review of every game that had come out up to that point, which was in 1993. And they gave Burning Force a horrendously low score of 28%, stating that it was a sad attempt at what should have been a thrilling blast 'em up. At the other end of the scale was the well-respected Mean Machine Sega, who in 1992 gave the game a score of 76%, saying, "It sounds good, but unfortunately the gameplay gets rather repetitive after a while." The comment doesn't seem to quite match up to the score there. Personally, I found that Burning Force was quite pleasant to play, and it certainly is very nice to look at as well, though I wouldn't say I found it the most exciting thing I've ever encountered. I think I would award it an overall score of 3.5 out of 5. That puts me squarely in line with the higher scores the game was getting. It's decent, but not spectacular. Now let's move on to our second game, which is Dig Dug 2 on the NES. I have a fondness for the original Dig Dug, despite never being especially good at playing it. Who can forget the catchy little tune that plays as you wander around, for instance? When I first tried Dig Dug 2 though, I hated it. It can initially be quite baffling to play, but when you figure it out, it turns out to be quite good fun. You still have access to your trusty pump from the first game, and should you wish, you can still dispatch the roaming Pukas and Figars via the conventional means, i.e. by inflating them until they burst. However, this game adds a second method for killing the cute monsters. Each of the islands in the game have fault lines with nodes on the ground, and you can dig at these spots in order to create a crack which then sends whichever is the smallest landmass crashing into the ocean waves. If you time this right, you can send the enemies to their doom, and if you do it to multiple baddies at once, you will earn a higher and higher score bonus, much more than just killing them normally. The catch is that if you get it wrong, it can be quite easy to accidentally throw yourself into the sea as well. You can also make tactical use of cracks on the ground to avoid the monsters because they can't cross the cracks without transforming. These were things that I was struggling with when I was first getting used to the game, and why I wasn't enjoying myself until I had figured it all out. Finding magazine reviews from the era proved to be quite a lot more tricky for Dig Dug 2, so instead I am turning to Nintendo Life and their review of the eShot release for the Nintendo Wii. They awarded the game a slightly above average rating of 6 out of 10, saying, "It's a novel concept, but it never really goes anywhere and eventually starts to get a little bit repetitive." Personally, I haven't quite got to the point where it has started to feel repetitive for me just yet. There are 72 stages and I have only managed to reach around stage 10 so far. I can see how the formula could start to get tired after a while though. Overall, I thought the game was pretty good fun, and on my review scale I would give it a 3 out of 5. Our third game for this collection is Dragon Spirit. This NES version comes with the subtitle The New Legend, and it is not the same game as the one found on the TurboGrafx 16. It is considerably easier for starters, and all the better for it in my opinion. While I do enjoy a good science fiction shoot 'em up with starfighters and so on, I enjoy a good fantasy based shooter even more. It's why I prefer Dragon Breed to R-Type. I feel really spoilt by this collection because I get not one but 2 really good fantasy shooters, with this one being the first. As the name would indicate, in this game you control a dragon who actually transforms when you collect power-up items, such as growing extra heads. However, he also becomes a slightly bigger target, so there is an element of risk and reward for powering up. You have 2 separate fire buttons, one for aerial targets and one for ground targets, which sounds fairly simple but during the more hectic moments proves enough to keep you on your toes, or rather talons. The game features a practice mode and the way of accessing it is actually rather ingenious. There is a short prologue mission, and should you do well then you just proceed into the normal mode. Should you die though, then you get moved into the practice mode with a powered up gold dragon. After clearing stage 1 in this mode, you then skip stage 2 entirely and proceed to stage 3. Despite this being a lot easier, I still haven't managed to beat it yet, because stage 3 itself does get pretty tricky later on. Still, compared to the TG16 version, this is a lot more fun, at least for me, a relative noob at shoot 'em ups. Hardcore shoot 'em up fans may just prefer the way the original plays over this one. While this NES game does contain its fair share of sprite flicker, as most NES games do, in the heat of the moment I didn't really notice it, nor did it hamper my enjoyment of the game overall. For our vintage review comparison, once again I'm finding magazine coverage a bit thin on the ground. So I am turning to the Honest Gamer's website and a review from 2004 instead. Our reviewer, Rob Hamilton, said, "When I played Dragon Spirit, I didn't notice an ugly game with weak bosses. I noticed a shooter with more depth and intriguing gameplay elements than I'd seen in a game of this sort for quite some time. A shooter that definitely must be considered one of the better for the NES. This went alongside a score of 4 out of 5. Personally, I don't find the game all that ugly. There are certainly far worse looking games than I have seen for the system. That being said though, I don't think I would rate the game quite so high overall, and instead I would put it on par with Burning Force at 3.5 out of 5. The fourth game in this collection is a stone cold classic, a game so entrenched in popular culture that it became a joke in Marvel's first Avengers movie. I am of course talking about Galaga, Namco's follow-up to the equally classic Galaxian, and their own attempt to take the Space Invaders genre and put their own spin on things. I expect that Galaga requires little introduction, but that wouldn't make for much of a video, and I suppose there's always whippersnappers coming along who aren't necessarily up to speed with the classics. So here's a summary. You control a ship at the bottom of the screen with the ability to move left, right and shoot. Waves of alien bugs will fly on the screen in groups of 3 or so before settling in formation. Your task is to annihilate all of them before moving on to the next, tougher wave. Occasionally some of the aliens will break out of formation and dive down towards you, taking the occasional shot as they go. Should you gun them down as they approach, they are worth more points. Sometimes one of the boss Galagas will fly down and fire a sonic wave that will capture your ship. In one of gaming's most worst kept secrets, if you then liberate the captured ship, it will return to your control and you will have double the firepower. but also be a bigger target for the enemy. Having a double ship is extremely handy during the challenging stages that break up the main ones. In these, waves of enemies will fly on the screen and then exit. You will be awarded bonus points for however many you shoot, with some extra points should you not miss any. That, in a nutshell, is Galaga. It's simple, it's addictive, it's timeless. Once again I am turning to Nintendo Life for my vintage review. Damien McFerrin had this to say in 2007. Little things such as the lack of a record saving feature, slow controls and just a generic simplistic feel keep it from being legendary. However, if you have a penchant for old arcade games, then you will probably be enjoying this. This came with a score of 7 out of 10 attached. I was tempted to award the game a perfect 5 out of 5 personally, but Damien's comments did highlight the fact that this version wasn't quite perfect. Of course, with the Evercade you can get around the lack of built-in high score saving by just creating a save state for the game, but remembering to do so could be a bit of a pain. I'm going to give the game a score of 4.5, as for all intents and purposes it is very similar to the arcade original. Now we come to my least favourite game in this collection, or at least it is a tie with one other game. Pac-Attack is Namco's attempt to do something along the same lines as Tetris, while shoehorning their mascot in at the same time. Tetris is so elegant and ingeniously simple, yet complex at the same time. You'd almost think it had always existed and not been thought up in someone's brain. Pac-Attack attempts to be slightly more complicated and yet manages to be infinitely more tedious as a result. The idea is that pieces fall down from the top of the screen into a well. Some of them are bricks and some of them are ghosts. You need to try and arrange them in such a way that there is a path of ghosts for Pac-Man to follow. Every fourth or so piece will include Pac-Man in it, so you drop him at the top of your ghost chain and watch him munch away for points. Creating an entire line of wall pieces will also clear them, which is important or you will face a game over very quickly. If you are smart enough, you can also set up a chain reaction where wall pieces will fall down and clear lines on the same turn as your move, but this isn't as easy as it is in other similar games. Nintendo Life's Marcel Van Doon reviewed this one on the site back in 2008, saying, "Pac-Attack may seem like a rip-off of other more popular falling block games, but it's actually a pretty good game," giving it a final score of 7 out of 10. I'm afraid in this case that I really don't agree, and I'm going to give it a score of 2 out of 5 myself. The game can't even rely on the multiplayer modes to give it a bit of a boost, because this can't be accessed on the Evercade. Every collection needs a few turds, I guess, and this is most certainly one of them. Thankfully, the collection bounces back with aplomb as we move on to the second of the two fantasy shoot-'em-ups. This time it's Phelios' time to shine, which is a conversion of an arcade game from 1989. I've actually bought the arcade version for the Nintendo Switch off the back of playing the Mega Drive version in this collection, and it is different enough to be worth owning both. The arcade original is displayed in a vertical tate format, whereas the Mega Drive version was reformatted to fit the standard 4x3 displays of the time. I think I actually prefer the graphics of the home port more than the original. They are more detailed and vibrantly coloured. In this game you take control of Apollo, who sits astride of the winged horse Pegasus, as he flies into battle in an attempt to rescue Artemis, the goddess of the moon, from the clutches of the Titan Typhon. Throughout the stages of the game he will have to fight and defeat many fearsome bosses including Medusa, the Grey, the Siren, Antaeus and Scylla. Much like Dragon Spirit: The New Legends, this home port of Phelios offers players the option of a practice mode, which is limited to the first 4 stages and is lacking the ending of the normal mode. While the game does allow you to pepper your enemies with rapid shots, that's not really the best way to play the game most of the time. Instead you should hold the fire button down and charge your shots, allowing you to cut down tougher enemies with ease. No shoot 'em up worth its salt would be without power-ups, and of course they are present here too, including speed-ups, options, enemy-seeking beams and more. The stages are well drawn and quite lengthy, often being split up into multiple sections. For example, partway through the first level, Artemis will descend and enter a temple. The arcade original was never brought over to the West due to having scenes between the levels which were deemed to be a bit too risque. These have been omitted from the home game, you may be disappointed to hear. This time I actually do have some genuine vintage magazine articles from back in the day to look at, so let's begin with the high end of the scale. Electronic Gaming Monthly's 4 reviewers gave out scores of 7, 9, 8 and 9. One of the 9s from Ed said, Phelios is a well-rounded, thought-out shooter for novices and experts alike. On the lower end of the scale is Sega Power from 1991, who gave the game 3 stars out of 5. They said, there's some neat gameplay, but the level select option means no surprises after the first day. Personally, I think this is arcade-style shooting fun at its best, and in fact is better than its arcade parent. While longevity could be a problem eventually, at the moment I am really loving my time spent with Phelios, and I'm going to give it a score of 4 out of 5. Next up we have Splatterhouse 2. I think it's a bit of a shame that the original Splatterhouse has been omitted from this collection, but the Evercade has yet to receive any TurboGrafx 16 games, so that would probably explain why it's missing. Perhaps the console is tricky to emulate, or they can't get permission to use any TG16 software. Who knows? Now then, I remember seeing the original Splatterhouse arcade machine when I was younger, and I was always a little bit creeped out by it and surprised that arcade owners could just have it out in the open for all to see, given the horrific subject matter. According to the internet, the original game was released in 1989, which would make me about 12 years old at the time, so I wasn't super young, but still it was a lot grislier than the usual stuff I would see on holiday or down the pier in my hometown. So I have never really been a fan of the series, to be honest with you. Combine the yucky visuals and theme with a difficulty level that falls on the challenging side, and it's never really been a game that I have wanted to spend a lot of time with. This sequel came out on the Mega Drive or Genesis in 1992, and I never saw it back then as I was firmly on the side of the Commodore 64 and then the Super Nintendo around that time. The plot picks up 3 months after the events of the first game. Despite Rick's girlfriend Jennifer losing her life at the conclusion of Splatterhouse 1, the Terror Mask reappears to tell Rick that there's still a chance to save Jennifer. In order to do so, he must return to the house and do battle against the horrific abominations that reside there once again. The game plays quite similarly to the original overall, with the same single plane side-scrolling gameplay, with you punching and kicking a wide variety of repulsive and squishy looking enemies. You can also pick up weapons from time to time, such as planks of wood, and use them to splat your enemies to death. Of course, there are boss fights at the end of each stage, which are no pushover to beat by any means, and should you die then you will be sent back quite far to the last checkpoint. Now, I am not very good at this game, which is another reason I don't like it all that much. I'm sure I could get better at it with practice, but I don't really care enough to want to do that. Before I give my final score though, let's go back to the classic magazines of the day and see what they thought of it. This time I have picked 2 UK-based magazines. On the higher end of the scale is James Scullion from Sega Pro, who awarded the game a score of 86%, saying it is the most fun you can have with the chainsaw without getting arrested. Andy Smith of Sega Power, on the other hand, gave the game a final score of 47%, saying, what a load of tosh, the gameplay's dull and repetitive, the graphics aren't gory, and the whole thing's not worth the first, second or third glance. Boring. Now, while Splatterhouse 2 definitely isn't my sort of game, I do think that this is being unnecessarily harsh. I can see how those who were into this kind of thing would quite enjoy it. So I think a score of 2.5 out of 5 is fair for this one. This is followed up in the collection by the inclusion of Splatterhouse 3, which is also on the Mega Drive or Genesis, and was originally released in 1993, though it wasn't given a PAL release in Europe at the time. This time the story jumps ahead about 5 years. Rick and Jennifer have been living quite happily together since the events of Splatterhouse 2, and they now have a son named David. The memories of the mansion and the Terror Mask have started to fade finally. Then, an evil nasty entity kidnaps Jennifer and David, and Rick finds himself having to don the mask once again in a race against time to save their lives. The gameplay of this third game in the main series has taken a significant shift and is now a brawler in the vein of something like Streets of Rage or Golden Axe, with you being able to move into and towards the screen while performing various fighting moves on the various monstrosities that are found throughout the stages. Each stage features quite a strict time limit and you are provided with a map, the idea being that you have to reach a certain location before the time runs out, or something terrible will happen to Jennifer, David or both of them. You will have to plan your route very carefully and dispatch of all the enemies as efficiently as possible in order to stand any chance of seeing the good ending. Even when playing well, you still have to absolutely haul ass. I was able to get to the first boss with a decent amount of time to spare, yet I was not able to beat it before the clock ran out, and so Jennifer suffered a terrible death as a result. I think this is quite an interesting new game mechanic, and it does add a considerable amount of tension to things. Other than the time limit though, I definitely found Splatterhouse 3 a lot easier to get on with, and punching the goo out of the creatures was a lot of fun. This time around, Brad from UK magazine Mega Action gave one of the highest scores of 85%, saying, if you're a lover of horror movies or beat-em-ups, then this game will be up your street. Once again, Sega Power had one of the lowest scores of the bunch, but it was considerably higher than the last game, with Dean Mortlock giving a rather tepid rating of 61%, concluding with, there are only 6 fairly easy levels, and the gameplay's been done to death. Next please. This time I'm definitely more inclined to agree with the higher of the two scores. As much to my surprise, I found myself liking Splatterhouse 3 quite a bit. Definitely the best in the series in my opinion, and worthy of a final score of 3.5 out of 5. The Tower of Druaga is one of those supposedly classic Namco games that I had never actually got around to playing before making this video, despite the premise sounding like something I might enjoy. The story sees the brave knight Gilgamesh being tasked with scaling 60 floors of the infamous tower in order to rescue the maiden key from the demonic Druaga. The 1984 arcade game spawned out of Namco's other maze games such as Pac-Man and Rally X, except of course it layered on a fantasy theme and had some very light RPG elements, such as treasure chests you can sometimes find power-ups inside. In Japan, the series is incredibly popular and has been cited as a direct inspiration for games such as Ys, Hydlide, Dragon Slayer and The Legend of Zelda. That's quite some legacy indeed. In the West, the game is a tad more obscure, however still fairly well known amongst the pantheon of Namco titles. The basic goal of each floor is to guide Gilgamesh around the maze and locate the key, allowing access to the next harder floor. Enemies will be roaming around, such as your common green slime on the low floors, armoured knights, and really annoying wizards who teleport around and fire their magic missiles at you. By default, you have your shield ready in order to deflect oncoming attacks from the roaming enemies, and by holding the fire button down you can get Gilgamesh to hold his sword out in front of him in order to attack your foes. If you strike a foe head on, they will die, but if you have your sword out and an enemy strikes you from behind or the side, you will be the one who dies instead. The issue with this is that it takes a while for Gilgamesh to fully extend his sword, and you are still vulnerable during this time, making it impossible to react fast to incoming attacks. This takes quite a lot of getting used to and led to many frustrating deaths until I started tackling each encounter slowly and steadily. I'm going to once again turn to the Nintendo Life review for this one, which was first published on the website in 2009 to mark the event of the Wii Virtual Console release. Marcel Van Dyne gave the game a score of 4 out of 10, saying, "This one is only really recommended for the truly sadistic gamers." Unfortunately, I find myself agreeing with Marcel. The dated and obtuse game design make the Tower of Druaga quite frustrating to play nowadays. There is a sizable challenge in store if you do find yourself enjoying it though. Overall, I'm going to give it a final score of 2 out of 5. Our penultimate game for this collection is Walkman, otherwise known as Warp and Warp in its original release in the United States. This was an arcade game from 1981 originally, then it was ported across to various systems including the MSX, the Sword M5, PV-1000 and then the Famicom in 1985, which is the version included on this cartridge. This is a charming little shoot 'em up where the player takes control of a monster fighter who must dispatch of all the aliens in a level in order to move to the next. The main gimmick behind this one is that there are 2 separate worlds that you can move between using the titular warps. In the first, you can shoot in the 4 cardinal directions with your gun. By going through the warp gate in the centre of the screen, you enter a more grid-like world where your gun is replaced with Bomberman-style explosives. You must drop them so that the explosions kill the roaming bad guys. If you successfully clear both worlds, you can then travel back to the first, where you are then given an amalgamation of both weapons. You shoot out bombs which explode on impact with walls or aliens. While playing, you should also keep an eye out for the special aliens who have one of the letters of extra, and then earn a bonus if you spell out the whole world. That, in essence, is the entire game. You repeat this process until you're out of lives. Official reviews for this one are a bit thin on the ground, but I did manage to find one from a website called Video Game Den. Here the reviewer gave the game a score of 3 out of 5, saying it's a simplistic yet fun game which does get repetitive after a while, but offers some nice score attack style action. I totally agree with this assessment and would give the game the same 3 out of 5 myself. It's definitely on par with Dig Dug 2. That just leaves us with Weaponlord, and spoilers, this has to be the worst game in this collection in my opinion. This game is a one-on-one fighter which sees a group of Conan the Barbarian style warriors doing battle with each other, and every character does hold some kind of weapon. This game was released on both the Super NES and the Genesis in 1995, with the Super NES version being the one picked for this cartridge. First impressions are good because the game features some great artwork and impressive character sprites. When you try and actually play the game though, things prove to be rather more frustrating than you may have anticipated. Now, according to the article I read on Hardcore Gaming 101, to get a bit more background info on this game, if you spend some time studying a list of character moves and practice a bit, then the game does become a lot more fun. I would like to believe that, because when I jumped in and attempted to play intuitively, I found it sluggish, unresponsive and incredibly difficult, even after I had turned the difficulty down to its lowest setting. Weaponlord also features a roster of just 7 characters, which even for the time was a little scant, and sadly the current licensing situation, whereby this Namco collection will only work on a handheld Evercade system, means that although the game does include a multiplayer mode, we are locked out of playing it. This could have been one of the redeeming features if we were allowed to experiment with a friend and get used to the characters at our own pace, but instead we're stuck with the impenetrable single player mode. Reviewers of the time were surprisingly positive about the game, with Scott Allen Marriott from Allgame giving a score of 4.5 out of 5, and summing up with, "Despite the issues, the depth of play makes Weaponlord a must-have title for the fighting game enthusiast." Like I said though, the tough single player mode doesn't really give me much chance to get good at the game and see what it offers below the surface. Instead I was left frustrated and unimpressed, and I'm giving the game a score of just 1.5 out of 5 as a result. And so it is time to finally bring this episode to a close with one last look at all of the scores I have given and my final thoughts on the cartridge as a whole. While there are a few duds in this collection, the hits still greatly outweigh the misses, and the true greats more than make it worth picking up. It may surprise some to see that such a simple game as Galaga is my favourite, but there is just something that's so classic and fun about that game that I can just go back to it at any time. My biggest discovery of the bunch is Phelios though. I had not encountered this game before I owned this collection, and it is truly a great fantasy shooter. Dragon Spirit the New Legend isn't far behind either, and it's more enjoyable than the TurboGrafx 16 version in my opinion. Thanks for taking the time to watch this episode. I know it's going to be a pretty long one by the time I'm done with it. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I do intend to have some more Evercade content in the near future, so please keep an eye out for it. See you on the next video, and in the meantime, take care.